Welcome to Human Potential at Work, the show where we explore social impact, inclusion, and empowerment of everyone, including persons with disabilities. Get ready to be inspired, hear success stories, and learn tips and principles for bringing out the best in everyone.
Hello, everyone. My name is Debra Rue, and I'm the CEO of Rue Global Impact, and you are watching or listening to Human Potential at Work. My guest today is somebody that he's really, I think the work that he's doing is even more critical than before the COVID-19. So I'm really looking forward to talking to Darryl Adams. He works with Intel. He's an Assistive Technology Innovation Program Manager in the Accessibility Offices at Intel, and he's going to tell us a lot more about what he's doing. But at a time when we send everybody home sheltering in place, accessibility has become more critical than ever before, and a lot of people are realizing what we have been talking about. But at the same time, he works with assistive technology, and accommodations are very important, also called adaptions in the United Kingdom. But making sure that people are accommodated, and this is not just for people with disabilities, this is for anybody that needs an accommodation. And we're going to really explore those topics more. So Darryl, welcome to the program. I'm really excited about our conversation today.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, so Darryl, tell us more about, your journey, how you got here, why did you join Intel, and what are you doing with, for Intel?
Sure. Well, yeah, it's quite a long journey. I started Intel back in 1996, and I came in as interestingly enough, I had basically an internet technologist role, where the company was just getting into, learning how to develop both streaming audio and video codecs in order to kind of basically enable the types of experiences that we have today here on the Zoom session. And I was able to do that because I did a brief stint out of college at AOL, where I came in out of college with a finance degree and just jumped into AOL really just as a matter of convenience. And they were working on technologies that were beyond the AOL service that we all know, but it was more about it being an internet service provider and getting into the nuts and bolts of the internet, the web browser, and the news groups and email clients and all these things. And so I had this 2-year whirlwind education about internet technology. And so that just basically helped me land that job at Intel. But since then, I have basically taken the majority of my career, over 20 years, doing technical project and program management work across the company. What led me to where I am today is that I have retinitis pigmentosa. So today I'm legally blind, and I'm also deaf in my right ear from a completely random, I guess, unrelated circumstance with a surgery that went poorly. But so because of this, retinitis pigmentosa is very much it's a degenerative condition. And so over the years, I've been, realizing these incompatibilities with my environment at work and trying to figure out how I remain competitive and remain, doing a good job at Intel. And it occurred to me that, as I've tried to focus on, what exactly is it going to be how am I going to continue working with technology and continue doing my job? I was so focused on figuring that out. I just got self-educated around assistive technologies. But then I realized, Intel is full of really smart engineers, and we do such great technology research and innovation that there's more to it than just my story. And so I really started thinking about how can I help Intel make better products that will be useful for everybody.
Which there's so much power in what you just said, but you were a technologist, and then you started losing your eyesight. You lost, part of your hearing, and I still think it's a shame in society that when people acquire disabilities, sometimes we don't do a really good job at helping them stay in the workforce. And you obviously add great value to Intel. Intel's lucky to have a technologist that also has the experience of, somebody that's blind and somebody that, has hearing loss. And so and once again, during these COVID-19 times, so, people are really starting to understand what we've been talking about true inclusion. I mean, deciding that some people, don't belong in the workforce is just really not good for society. So I just really appreciate your journey and the work that you're doing. So I assume I know this answer, but let me ask you, why do you think Intel cares about accessibility? Why do they care about making sure that really talented people like you are working for them and innovating for them?
Well, I know that certainly as in recent years, it has become very apparent, at Intel and across the industry that there is tremendous untapped potential in the disability community at large around, people that are extremely qualified for jobs who are not getting them. And I think companies such as Intel are really starting to open our eyes to that potential and realizing that, that it's worth looking and worth engaging in that community to bring people on board, get the right talent at the right place at the right time. And, so I think we're going to see a lot more of that. And I think, over time, just inherently things are becoming more accessible. It's such a long road ahead, to say, before we're at a point where everything is accessible for everybody. But when I compare what we have today to, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, it's just a much better situation, I feel like we're somewhat on a, it's more than a linear curve in terms of how this is improving. And so because of that, I think we're going to be more able as a company to be a really welcoming, place to work for people with disabilities. And in my hope, more than welcoming, but I'm hoping that we're a destination of choice. And I'm really looking forward to seeing how the next several years go, where we are able to bring in a more diverse work population and go well beyond accommodating them and having people thrive.
Right. And I forgot to ask Darryl, but where are you joining us from today? Where are you sheltering in place today?
Outside of Portland, Oregon.
Okay. All right. Oh, I love Oregon. What a beautiful state that is.
Yes.
So how are y'all doing in Oregon? I haven't heard as much about Oregon as I've heard other states.
Well, I think relatively speaking, pretty well.
Okay.
However, we are on, again, they're calling it, spikes in Oregon at this point. So relative to what we were doing earlier on, when everything's really started happening, it's becoming more like the numbers are going up. So it's not,
right.
We have to be careful, but we're certainly not at the levels of California, Arizona, Texas, Florida.
Right. I know that's happening in Virginia too. Our governor's been conservative, which I am very grateful for. And but despite best efforts, as we start moving around, more cases are coming in. So it's hard to watch it. And another reason why technology is so important, because technology can allow us to keep doing our jobs, keep being educated. I know that we got a lot of work to do, but it's very different times. But I know you talked a little bit about your journey, but I would love to know more about, because you actually said to me that you have a dream job at Intel. And so tell us more about the path that took you there. And once again, kudos to Intel for understanding, that diversity and inclusion really equals innovation, creativity, and certainly productivity. I mean, you're a wonderful example of that. So, but tell us more about the path to your dream job.
Yeah, so it's I have to say that it started. There's a couple of things. The first thing that happened was that I got introduced to a gentleman named Ben Foss, who no longer works at the company, but he was a dyslexic employee, and he was highly motivated. And he actually developed what we know as the Intel reader. And in early stages of that work, we connected, and I helped him with some early stage design, but also mainly brought the project management piece to it. So I helped him get his initial thinking into a point where it got to the first prototyping stage. And at the time, I wasn't really thinking a lot of it. I thought it was a great idea, and Ben was a fantastic employee that was hugely driven. And it didn't occur to me after the fact that it was such a shining example of something of what Intel can enable, in that a single employee with a problem and an idea and ambition made a product that went to market and helped many people. And so the fact that can be done was highly motivating to me, and eye-opening to say that, even though could be maybe a small cog in a large machine, you absolutely can make a difference in that way. So that was the first thing. Secondly, I was working with a coworker of mine, and we were in the office, and he was noticing that I wasn't seeing him. He would come approach me to the side, and he would start talking, and I would just be working away. He thought I was just so focused. And then I told him, I said, well, I can't hear it in my right ear, so I'm not hearing when you come up, and I don't see you in my periphery. We started brainstorming, and we basically built this hat with a microcontroller attached to it and a sonar sensor that would alert me when somebody came up to the side. And it was so funny. It was a totally nerdy thing.
But how fun.
But I blogged about it internally, and then it connected with a group of researchers that were doing work around sensory augmentation for blind people, using our camera technology and sensing technologies. And so they said, do you want to help us out? And I said, sure. And that led to some really interesting prototyping work and some awesome, potentially useful technology. And we ended up going to being on stage with the CEO of Intel at CES for the keynote. And it was that kind of was a pivotal moment in my career to say that the company cares about this stuff and the industry cares about this stuff, and we can make a difference. And specifically, I can play a role there.
Yeah, that's an amazing story. And just, we see this over and over and over again. When we have a diverse workforce, everybody wins. And so that's really powerful. Now, I know that you support Intel with accommodations. Do you mind talking a little bit about, besides that hat you built, which is a cool story, but what assistive technology do you use to do your job?
So that is a ongoing story. And so it's the story of going from no need to initially really trying to, I guess, optimize the display, because with my vision, I can see somewhat directly in front of me, but really nothing on any side. So looking at a computer is doable, but not great. And so I'm having contrast problems. And so basically what I do is I use, we use Windows. And so I use a lot of the capabilities that Microsoft provides with Windows 10 around just screen magnification. And I use high contrast mode. So everything, I prefer a dark background to everything. So because it's the bright background is pretty straining. And more recently, I've been actually using an eye tracker, which is fantastic, because one of my big issues is I can never find the mouse pointer. Okay. And so it's just sort of this weird, like, mechanical thing that I have to do in order to find my mouse and to use the mouse effectively. So what I've done is I've created basically a keyboard shortcut that allows me to very quickly put the mouse cursor right in my gaze. And so anytime I need the mouse, I just hit a button, and then the cursor is right in front of me, which is, I mean, that's a little thing, but it's really cool.
Right. And I love that. I know that I used to say to Microsoft with my old company, Tech Access, if they hadn't worked so hard to build accessibility into their operating system, I couldn't have a company like I used to have with Tech Access, where all of my employees telework. Everyone teleworks at my current company, Rue Global Impact too, and over 90% of my team are technologists with disabilities. But it's fascinating that we've come to a point where you are able to pretty much use mainstream technology to do your work. You don't have to have additional things. And of course, one thing I always say to companies when they say, well, how should we be accommodating our employees with disabilities? And I said, the very first thing you want to do is talk to the employee, because people often know what their needs are. So I might assume, Darryl, that because you're legally blind, you use a screen reader. So, and I just think your story is very compelling because you are a technologist, but you are using mainstream tools, and maybe in the future you will use things like screen readers. But and I'm fascinated that you use eye gaze, because our chief accessibility officer, Rosemary Musashi, she uses eye gaze technology, and it's been a real game changer for her.
Yeah, and I do use a lot of audio for consumption. So when I my main when I read, I'm using Audible or just audiobooks in general. I'll do a lot of the voiceover stuff when I have to consume a lot of written information, because I read too slowly. It's too inefficient, and I can't keep up with the amount of information that I need to take in. So I usually will use an audio and fairly fast audio as well. I found that to be very helpful, and that technology is coming along really fantastically as well.
And I'll tell you, Darryl, that I also use the audio, because as I've aged, I have gotten dry eye syndrome, very common in women over a certain age, and it hurts. My eyes, unfortunately, hurt and burn all the time, and also my vision, of course, as I've gotten older, it's gotten worse. And so seeing shadow, it's just part of being human, right? And so I am to the point that I won't buy a book if it's not offered in an audio version. There's some books I really want, but they're not available. And I'm an author myself. And my last book, Inclusion Branding, I made audio, and it was hard. It was hard work doing it. You got to read it, so I know it's more work for the authors, but actually I think more and more of us are consuming data that way. And also different learning types prefer to use, audio. So I think, as we progress, we're starting to understand that humans do consume data in different ways and technology in different ways. And corporations need to give us options so that we can select what's best for us, certainly as employers and as customers. So I love the story you were telling about Intel, but do you mind telling us a little bit more about Intel's efforts with accessibility and accommodations?
Sure. Yeah. So over time we've had let's see, I would say, so beyond these sort of innovation pieces that I've described, we have probably, I'll give it a 7 or 8 year history with accessibility in terms of somebody at Intel, deliberately working to make improvements in that area. And I say that because this was I think I would consider the beginnings of accessibility at Intel quite a grassroots effort. And there were people such as myself that were coming together both at sort of a voluntary basis and kind of above and beyond type of work to make it happen. And there was a few people that were dedicated, but there was not a top-down structure. But over the past few years, we've been accelerating this quite significantly. And so now we have an accessibility office that sits within our IT organization, but is very closely aligned with and collaborating with our diversity and inclusion organization. And we have, our global disability employee resource groups in the local chapters there. And we have all of these different sort of avenues where we're touching the influencing the culture and just really engaging employees. But today, what we have is a 5-pillar strategy that is that basically consists of innovation, workplace, culture, people, and partnerships. And clearly, where I'm spending most of my time is in that innovation bucket, and we can talk more about that as well. But beyond what I'm doing, around the workplace, we've got people that are really looking at ensuring that when employees need accommodations, they have the ability to get that, to get the accommodations they need, and to ensure they're able to perform the job as expected. We, in the culture pillar, where this is really where we're talking about getting that top-down executive sponsorship and the voice, the amplification of our voice and support around what it means and why it's important to have an accessible and inclusive culture and inclusive workplace. And then the people pillar is all about that sort of the life cycle of an employee, from recruitment to hiring to retention to growth. And that's all very much in the disability context as well, which is fabulous to see. And then we have the partnerships is thinking about how we are positioned, publicly as a company, what our voice is in the industry, and who we are working with, and ensuring that we are helping drive that accessibility vision, our vision, and just the industry's vision of making all technology accessible to all people, making that a reality.
Which is really impressive. For people that might not know how big Intel is, I know obviously Intel's a global company. It's, I've known about Intel for so long. The logo is like stuck in my brain because I've seen it on so many computers, that little Intel logo. But how many countries is, how big is Intel? So I know you can answer that in different ways, so I apologize. Sorry.
Right. So an employee base, it's 100 and any given time, 110,000 people or so of official Intel employees, and then a lot of contingent workers as well. But we're pretty globally distributed across the U.S., the Americas, Europe, Asia. But what's probably interesting that people may not be as aware of is that everyone, I think, knows of the Intel brand and thinks of the brains of the computer, which right. Clearly that remains the case. But there's so much that goes on beyond that. Intel in the context of the brains and the processor, we actually build like the complete computer to make it easier for our partners to build theirs. So we don't just send the processor to them. We provide full everything that's required to make a computer we can build, and we do. But in addition to that, we have significant work in everything from like 5G infrastructure to autonomous driving to Internet of Things. We have a really large Internet of Things group, and then the data center folks that are really working on, working with all the major cloud providers and figuring out ways to make computing, less power hungry, more green, more efficient, and a lot of AI. So across everything that I've just said, there's probably a foundational artificial intelligence component to that, and we've got a lot of people working in that space. So we do, if it's computing, it's probably somebody at Intel that's working on it. So it's quite a broad portfolio, and that might be news to many.
I think it probably is. Whenever we were talking, when we first started talking about you being on the show, I mean, I just know Intel so well, once again, from computers, but I did not realize how much. I didn't realize that Intel was into IoTs, for example, and artificial intelligence and autonomous vehicles, which all of those things are going to improve society and disenfranchise parts of society as well. So it's very important work that Intel's doing. I also did not realize that Intel had such a commitment to inclusion. And so I was, I try to, focus on what different, and I had heard about Intel in the space, but as you and I talked a little bit more, I didn't realize the efforts that had been made. And I really applaud Intel. I mean, you had mentioned in the interview today that, about employment. And of course, all of us companies, especially the gigantic global companies, really want to be employers of choice. So it's good for our community to know and support brands like Intel because they're actually supporting and employing our community. So I think that's why these conversations I think are really powerful because we do have choices. And I'm hoping that more and more the choices will be made focused on the corporations that are really trying to make a difference. Like you also just mentioned, climate change, making sure things are green. And I think more and more, especially the younger parts of our society, they want to work for companies that are making a difference and are doing more than just focusing on, profit lines and shareholder value. We want really societal value as well. So I think that Intel deserves a lot of kudos for having people like you and the rest of the teams really making a difference here. And I was wondering, Darryl, if you could put on a mentor hat for a little while. And right now, really weird times with COVID-19. There's a lot of fear, a lot of lost jobs, and it's hard to predict where we're going. But I'm just hoping that in the long run, we're going to all evolve. And technology can be a great equalizer, especially for the community of people with disabilities. So having Intel in these conversations and innovators like you in these conversations, I think are critical to where we're going. But, if what kind of advice would you have for young people with disabilities that, they might have, I was talking to a woman yesterday and I felt so bad for her because she did everything she was told, make good grades, go to college, get your master's degree. She did everything. And she's actually, and she told me she was cleaning toilets. She cannot find a job. And unfortunately, she couldn't find a job for, it's been 2 years. And she's so discouraged. Now you put COVID-19 on top of that. And it's really, I think there are a lot of young people that are very discouraged. So I don't know if you have any words of wisdom because things are so different. So I don't want to put you on the spot, but what can other young people learn from your journey?
It's an interesting time because nobody, like, there's no recipe here. There's no playbook.
Right.
But I would say, I think COVID aside, there is no better time in history to have a disability. And
I just love that comment because your brother is human.
Yeah, just if I think back just even to the beginning of my life where technology was, and I don't necessarily want to frame everything as where technology is the solution to all problems, but clearly it does when we're in such a connected world, and communication and engagement is so important, and relationships building is important, but having access to information is critical, and especially having equal access to information. So when you're talking with people, you all have the same ability to access the same information and understand whether what the source is and is it valid, and all these things. All these things are critical, and if you do not have access, that's our problem. We need to. That is the problem that we need to solve. And I think today there are less people that don't have access, but there are still too many. So first of all, I guess that's my first thinking is that we are in a good place in terms of where we are going with technology and and enabling people to have access. And hopefully in the years to come that you can be in a better place. But coming at it, in terms of what you can do, thinking about my personal background, the way that I found the job that I have today was I knew what I wanted to do, and because I wasn't doing it officially and it didn't exist, I started volunteering doing that job. And so I created the job that I have by doing the job and then making it become important enough that it should be an actual job. Now, putting that in the context, if you're coming out of college, that's slightly more difficult, I would imagine, but I think that there are options when you can, when you're in college still. I think it's really useful to have to go down the internship path, or any type of way that you can get to create a relationship with a company that you admire. And be clear with that one as well, is that like, just because it's hard the job market is tight, doesn't mean that you shouldn't be looking at the companies or the opportunities that you want the most and that you admire the most. Because if you really want it, you'll be much more motivated to do the work to get it, one way or the other. That's a very general statement, though. Like, I recognize that it's highly challenging right now to, you can't just make up a job. But but the critical thing is that don't lose sight of, what is, either if you have a passion, what is it, and follow it. If you don't, continue to figure out what is highly interesting and who you admire in terms of a company. Because like, I really feel like if you admire them and you feel like they're doing the right things for the right reasons, then you'll find a way in, and that's important.
I agree. And I remember when I first went into the job market was so bad. It was just so bad. There was terrible unemployment. And I remember the employer I was working for when I first went into corporate America, they told me, they were telling all of us, well, if you don't like your job, there's 1,000 people waiting right outside to take it. And I remember it just made me feel very unvalued. And I was young, I didn't have a lot of experience, but I felt very unvalued by this company. And I worked for them for a year, and then I left and I went and became a waitress, which I actually enjoyed, and worked my way through college. But I think it's just so important that you do find find who you admire. I liked that point, find who you admire. What company, and that's why I think it's also so important for companies to tell us what you're doing. Tell us that you're focusing on accessibility. Tell us that you have an accommodation program. Tell us you mentioned global employee resource groups where the employees are getting together, and your employees are your best assets. All companies know that. And so I really like what I'm hearing from what you're talking about, Intel. I've always had I have a good impression of Intel. It's interesting how we decide which brands we do and do not like. And I always have had a very positive impression of the Intel brand. I perceive them as one of the good companies, and where I even get that from, I don't know. At some point, you might have to think about it, but I think part of it is because I do know that they are focused on making sure that they're being responsible with our climate, and I've heard Intel talking a lot about the green movement, and that's something very important to me. So, and then Darryl, as you and I were talking, I became even more impressed. But I think another thing that young people can do is get on social media and follow the conversations and actually join the conversations. I find that more and more the younger people, they're braver than I was as a young person. They are not afraid to get out there and join the conversations. It's like, oh, be quiet. No, oh, wait a minute, what? Oh, that's so interesting. So I think they have that advantage as well.
Well, I think a nuance to that is joining. I love the idea of joining the conversation, and in a constructive way, in terms of when you're in the online conversations, presenting solutions and proposals, and rather than
bashing,
jumping on the problem, right? Like, I think
I agree. We got too much of that going on.
Right. Yeah, and I think but that's the pitfall. Like, it's easy to do that. It's easy to be a critic, especially when it's somewhat anonymous. But when you're looking at using social media to position yourself for an employer as somebody who is a prospective candidate, then you want to be really, show yourself off in a positive light, and be real specific about it. Like, if there's a problem you think a company can solve and you have a possibility, talk about it.
Right. I agree. And I see that, and I think, we're all sort of learning how to use technology still. It's still surprisingly young if you think about how much has happened, in our lifetimes with technology, and we're still learning. I know that one time, I've mentioned this on air before, but I had mentioned I can't wait for driverless cars, autonomous vehicles to be available, everywhere. And because I know it would benefit my husband, who can't drive anymore due to dementia, and certainly would support my daughter, who was born with Down syndrome, that just is not going to have the cognitive ability to drive. And it was, somebody said, yeah, but I'm not going to do it because those cars killed 3 people. And I was like, yeah, but 1 million people a year all over the world die in car accidents, 1 million people. So, I agree. Technology isn't all of the answers, but technology is really a great equalizer. So I think that's important.
I think, it's very easy to understand why a lot of people have mixed feelings about cars that drive themselves, and because of technology in itself, there are bugs, but I think that over time, that the ability for the system in aggregate, the autonomous driving systems, to just outperform humans is just inevitable, and it really.
So true.
But it changes everything, because not only does it, for me, it already, the model is already in place with ride share. And so even though that's not self-driving, it's the same basic thing. I call an Uber or a Lyft, and they arrive at my door, and I go, and that's been a game changer for me to get from A to B.
That's a wonderful example.
So the model's there, just now it becomes autonomous. And then once you have autonomous cars, you don't really need parking lots,
right?
Like at scale, if you think well beyond just a few, because in fact, I don't think that necessarily a lot of people don't need to own driverless cars either.
Right,
because
right.
Why would you own a car that drives itself?
And that's what the young people, they're not buying cars like they used to, because it's, especially if you're in urban areas, it's just as easy to get around with an Uber. And now I know things have gotten weird with pandemic, but yeah, it is. And I also think it's important to note that when we talk about autonomous vehicles, we're not always talking about 100% driverless cars, because I know as a consumer that I, a couple of years ago, bought Subarus. I was always a Toyota fan, and we went with Subaru because it had all these safety features, which actually made me a better car. I made a better driver, because I'm like everybody else. I'm a little bit of a distracted driver sometimes. And unfortunately, it's happened to be a couple of times, or I should say fortunately, in that the car has decided that I was not stopping fast enough, and the car has taken the controls away from me. And it shocks me, but I also am always really grateful, because I don't want to get in a car accident. So I think also the autonomous vehicle, the efforts that are being made are also making our current vehicles so much safer too. I just wanted to point that out.
Absolutely.
So, all right, Darryl, I could talk to you for hours and hours and hours, but I know that we're almost out of time, but I'd like to give you the final words, but I would also like you, if you don't mind, to tell the audience how they could find out more about you. I know you're on social media because you and I are connected on LinkedIn, and also tell them how they can find out more about the work that Intel is doing with accessibility and inclusion, and, let's make sure people know how to get hold of you. But at the same time, I know that the pandemic has also changed the nature of your work. And so if you want to, in your final words, talk a little bit about that too, I think people would find that interesting.
Sure. So I think, well, maybe let's start with the pandemic thing. So I think that I have to say that I'm really, really fortunate in that I recognize that people all over the world are either out of jobs because of this. And it's a horrible situation.
It is.
And then I realized that the people that are working are often working in circumstances that are far from ideal, because they had a job in an office and now they're sitting at their house, and maybe they have young children or things going on at home, and they don't have the setup that they have at the office, and so it's not easy. And fortunately for me, one of the things that I had done years ago is that, based on the nature of my disability, I have an accommodation that says that I can work from home when needed. And so because of that, I have a really nice setup at home. I have an office and I have like all of the things I discussed as for my computer ergonomically correct. Everything is good. So it is the same, I think it's probably slightly better than working in the office. So when I had to work at home, it was very natural. And so now the difference is for me is that my kids are schooling at home and my wife is also working at home. We've made accommodations around the house for everyone having their space, and it's been quite effective. But what it really is, I think, myself and many people that I'm working with are very tuned into the fact that this is not that this is a problem for a lot of people, but also for people in particular with various levels of hearing loss. Working remotely and having to communicate with people, maybe not always with video, is very difficult. And so it's really focused us on wanting to solve the captioning problem in a much more real way. And so it has, so far, I think it's been a positive net effect where captioning is part of our conversation in many contexts where it might not have been prior to this. It's basically sped up the adoption and the urgency around making sure that everything that we're doing is captioned and that we're putting that technology in place.
Which is really exciting. It's very exciting because that's the upside is we're learning a lot during this, even though it's a terrifying time. So
yeah, and so I think, and so as far as for me, I am on social media. I am a big believer in networking and the use of LinkedIn for that as well. So if you can catch me on LinkedIn, would be fantastic. I'm on Twitter. I'm sort of a bit more of a lurker there, but my intention is to become a little bit more vocal. But I clearly love to develop that community as well.
And I have an idea. Yeah. We need to get you on Access Chat, the other show that I co-host with Neil Milliken and Antonio Santos, and we're talking about accessibility and disability inclusion. So I'll send you an email about that because I think we could have I would like to have another powerful conversation just from that lens on Access Chat, AXS Chat.
Yep. Yeah, I'm a follower. That'd be great. And I think if you follow We Are Intel on Twitter, that is kind of that's an account that does a fair amount of kind of communication and stories and amplifying a lot of the types of things that we're doing around. Sometimes it'll be accessibility, but they're a broad channel that talks about either whether it be inclusion or sustainability, responsibility, those types of things. So it's a good thing to follow as well.
Well, good. Well, Darryl, I thank you so much for coming on the program today and for all the work you're doing, and bravo to Intel for understanding that having a good workforce that includes diversity really is very beneficial and certainly helps with innovation. So when I think of Intel, I always think about innovation. Once again, they have done a good job at making me think they're a great brand. So, and you just cemented that in my consciousness. So I really, really appreciate everything you do and how you're trying to make it a better place. And I think it's going to take all of us to really change the world. So thank you so much for being on the program today, Darryl.
Thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure talking to you.
I agree. So we will continue the conversation on Access Chat. So thank you, Darryl, and thanks everybody for watching the program today. And please link with Darryl Adams on LinkedIn. And he's a very, very smart, innovative man. So we're really lucky that he's in the field. So thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.